Okay, we are continuing now with the spilling of the tea. Last week, you saw us talk about the first day or so of the academic conferences of ETS, NEAS, and ASOR. Today, we give you part two on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, Wednesday, November 19th afternoon session. After lunch, I made my way to the next talk, which was at the Sheraton Hotel. ETS this year was split up between two hotels, the Marriott, where most of the papers were, and the Sheraton. The Sheraton was about a 10-minute walk away. So I hobbled on over there and found my way to the paper. I wanted to see Carmen Imes' lecture on the Psalms in Egypt. As I entered the room, I was greeted by an old friend, Steve Matheson. Now, Steve was the head pastor at my church when I was going to Trinity Divinity School, and he was an adjunct instructor at TEDS. We chewed the fat a little bit and caught up in old times, and then I sat down in the row in front of him and started playing with my phone. After I sat down, Carmen Imes walked from the podium and greeted Steve. Now, Imes is an Old Testament professor at Biola. Apparently, she and Steve were old colleagues. She then turned to me and said, quote, "You must be David Falk." Now, I've gotten that line so often that it's clear that I've become a monster of myth at ETS. And I responded, I am. And she said, "I've so wanted to meet you. No one knows ancient Egypt better than you. I've relied heavily upon your book for my SBL paper." And she's talking about the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context. My first instinct was to say, what? But I was much more diplomatic and said, well, Ken Kitchen did beat it into me. And she said, "If there's any problems with my paper today, please let me know." Like, okay, cool. So then the next paper, after she returned to the lectern, her paper started. And it was entitled Selectively Singing the Signs and Wonders, Psalm 78 and 105 and the Exodus. Now, I really liked Carmen's paper. I think she made a solid case that through selectivity, Psalm 78 and Psalm 105 had to be based upon the book of Exodus, not the reverse. So I really loved the paper. I thought the paper was fantastic. And I even told her so, which I very rarely do. She did make one small mistake, which I found that had been caught by not just me, but someone at the banquet as well. She said that Egypt didn't have vineyards. After the lecture, there was a long line to meet her. She has quite the fan following. But when the line cleared up, I talked to her just before the next lecture. I told her that I loved her paper and that I don't give that praise often, and she said she believed it. Then I told her that Egypt had been producing wine since the Nagata III period, and our first evidence of writing comes from the use of wine dockets that were used to label wine jars of vintages produced in Egypt. She was grateful for the correction and asked me if I would read her SBL paper before she gave it on Monday. I agreed and edited her paper late Thursday night. Of course, the irony is that I helped the person who was instrumental in my lifetime ban at SBL give a better paper. But I don't think she remembers any of that. For the time being, I'm happy with that. I would much prefer to be friends with Carmen than to drag up the grievances of the past. So, I'm happy to say that I think I made another new friend. Okay. The next paper I attended was by David Wood, When Theologians Rewrite History, the Problem of the Quran's Satanic Verses. Now, his session was right next door to Carmen Imes, so it was natural for me to just go over there. Wood is an Islamic scholar, a Christian apologist, and a YouTube celebrity. And his session there was a lot of people there. He draws quite the crowd. His talk revolved around the Satanic Verses, a set of of surahs in the Quran where Muhammad is deceived by Satan, permits intercession with three pagan gods, shirk, and shows how modern Islamic theologians have tried to deal with this issue. Wood argues that the earliest and best Islamic sources said the satanic verses are genuine, and those scholars had no problem with the prophet being deceived by Satan and repenting of his deception, while modern Islamic historians have claimed that these verses are not genuine. Now, Wood posits that there were three classes of non-Quranic literature: the Tabaqat and Tariq, the Tafsir, and the Hadith, and that each class of literature has its own historiography, basically method of verification and proof. The Hadith is passed down through a chain of custody known as the Isnad, and Islamic theologians argue that the satanic verses are not canon because one link in the Isnad chain is an unknown person to them. Wood argues that the scholarship supporting the satanic verses is as genuine comes from the Tafsir, and the theologians are using the higher Hadith Isnad method upon the Tafsir sources. Now, all of this sounds good, but the moderator, another Islamic scholar, whose name is Ayman Ibrahim, tore Wood's thesis apart, saying there is no material difference for the isnads of the Tafsir and the Hadith. So, even though following his lecture, Wood has now posted a video recording of it, he didn't record the rebuttal. And I would not use Wood's method at this point as an apologetic. I don't think it's sound. At least it has not properly addressed the criticisms involved. So make of this what you will. After Wood's lecture, I went to the ETS banquet and ate rubber chicken. Yum! Delicious. I love rubber chicken. But after the banquet, I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School's alumni reception. Or I should say, wake. As many of you already know, TEDS is merging with Trinity Western University in 2026. Now, TWU, Trinity Western University, is an institution that I'm very familiar with, since I have a personal connection to that school. My mother was a fundraiser for the school in the 1960s, and I grew up in the Evangelical Free Church of Canada. But the mood of this reception wasn't one of jubilation. It was more of a hard sell. The speech given by interim President David Powell was one of see the happy side of this merger or else. Now, TEDS was already in a state of decay at the time of the merger. When I went to Trinity, there were 5,000 students on the campus. As of 2024, that number had declined to 852. They laid off a bunch of faculty, and retired faculty weren't replaced. Today, they have 22 faculty. 17 of them were invited to go to Trinity Western University. 11 accepted the offer. Now, from what I gathered, many of the faculty are planning to live in Bellingham, Washington, and driving to Langley, BC. All of them apparently oblivious to the driving times. As the crow flies, the distance seems quite short, but the trip is through a winding mountain road with lots of choke points, including an international border. The best case driving time is 55 minutes, but rush hour is typically between 2.5 to 4.5 hours. That is a long drive, kiddies. Are we there yet? Moreover, the TEDS administration claimed that they wanted this merger to be a blessing to Canada. But they also said they wanted to primarily hire from TED's PhD graduates from the USA. Wait, hold on. They would rather commit intellectual incest using graduates from the United States than hire Canadian scholars. They didn't seem to get that intellectual incest was part of their problem. They've been hiring from their own PhDs for years now, and this has created issues with the scholarly integrity of the college. So their plan is just continue to do the same stupid practices in a new location. Furthermore, people at this alumni reception were blissfully unaware that Trinity Western University already had one seminary, which had shut down in the early 1980s because it wasn't profitable, instead focusing on trades such as nursing, engineering, and law. What happens when Trinity Western University finds Trinity Evangelical Divinity School to be unprofitable again? Moreover, Northwest Baptist College and Seminary went into partnership with TWU and it ended up being a rump college. It looks like if you crawl into bed with TWU, you tend not to crawl out. There's also the fact, too, that there are already 5 theological colleges in the Vancouver area, and their fates have not been good. You have Vancouver School of Theology, Carey Theological College, Pacific Life Bible College, and Regent College. Most of these colleges have abandoned their degree programs in favor of a la carte adult education. And that's because the local area and local denominations do not support theological education. In the Vancouver area, you are more likely to be a pastor if you were a used car salesman than if you had a theological education. That's a reality that most of the local theological colleges have had to come to terms with, but TED's is Pollyannish-like unaware of. Finally, TED seems to think by situating itself in Langley that its primary draw will be from students in the Pacific Rim and Southeast Asia. While David Powell drew many foreign students to TED's because his dad was a famous pastor in Korea, Canada is taking a hard look at the student visa situation. In 2023, Canada suspended all foreign student visas because of the prevalence of immigration fraud. As of this year, 75% of student visas from India have been denied because of irregularities in their application process. Okay? While to some extent, student visas have been restored under the Carney government, they remain deeply unpopular with Canadians. Eventually, there will be a change in government, and that issue will once again come to the fore. Overall, the governance of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School has taken a damn the facts approach to this merger, and it has failure written all over it. Okay, now we're on to Thursday, November 20th in the morning. I started my day at ASOR, the American Society of Overseas Research, and had a decent breakfast for the first time during the conference. And I went to a paper by Jamie Fraser titled Reevaluating the Early Bronze Age Collapse, Concurrent Early Bronze 3 Urban and Early Bronze 4 Rural Trajectories in Light of New Radiocarbon Data from the Khirbet Gozlan in Jordan. Now, Fraser is addressing the idea that there was a collapse of civilization during Early Bronze 2 to Early Bronze 3. His archaeology showed potsherd assemblages that are typical of Early Bronze 4. But the carbon-14 dates for the site dated to Early Bronze 2. He claims that we don't even know what Early Bronze 4 looks like, so concluded that Early Bronze 4 pottery could have shown up in Early Bronze 2. Now, Fraser steps through many of the issues that could have affected carbon-14 dates. including cross-contamination, calibration curves, etc. However, I did notice that he missed a potential cause, which is the carbon sink issue within the Levant. I don't think Jordan would have been immune to that issue, but it showed me that he has not read all the literature concerning the issue. I also attended the following paper by Tricia Bray, an Egyptian statue and Egyptian-style signet ring found at Khirbet Sufra, Jordan. Now, in this paper, Bray reported finding an Egyptian statue that was styled in the 13th dynasty pose, which is pretty interesting. However, it's found in an Iron Age context. For her, this indicated that Khirbet Sufra had a trade relationship with Egypt amidst growing isolationism. So it showed that even though in the Iron Age context here of, say, the Jordan area, it still managed to get trade goods in and out. So that was kind of an interesting result. After Bray's paper, I went back over to the ETS for the last day of the conference. At noon, I had a meeting with my publisher. She has given me until the new year to finish my sample chapter. Apart from that, we talked mostly about vampire cults, which is kind of funny. Okay, following my meeting with my publisher, I waited for the next NEAS session, when I was approached by none other than Douglas Petrovich. He was friendly and cordial, and he wasn't plying me for information. The dude has mellowed out a lot, and it's really good to see. I love the fact that I could actually talk to him in a cordial manner. So it was, I'm going to count this as that the hatches are buried. So this is really excellent to see, and very, very encouraging. Okay, now we're moving on to Thursday, November 20th in the afternoon. And the next paper I attended was at the NEAS, and it was given by Joshua Hunter, entitled Jeremiah and the Tale of Two Potters, Exploring the Egyptian Background of Anthropogeny by Clay. Now, Hunter compares the Khnum pottery scenes to Jeremiah's references to pottery and his exile in Egypt. It's interesting to note at the beginning of this session, Scott Stripling left early to catch his flight. And with Stripling out of the room, the tone of the session completely changed, which you could just sort of feel the tension in the room evaporate, with Stripling exiting. So that was very interesting. Now, regarding the paper, there was nothing earth-shattering about this paper. But what was more interesting was the drama that followed it. At several points in the paper, Hunter quoted Budge. If you've been on this channel for any length of time, you know that what a big mistake that can be. Budge was not a great scholar, and his translations are terrible. He's a source that's best avoided. When Hunter finished the paper and the question period was done, I went up to the lectern and warned him about the dangers of using Budge. As I returned to my seat, I was stopped by Gary Uri, moderator of the NES paper sessions, and he said to me that he wanted to apologize. At first, I didn't know what he was talking about. Then it hit me. Last year, when I was at the NES paper by Peter Vanderveen, Roger Young sat down beside me. Roger saw my name tag and got agitated just by sitting down beside me. It was, I guess for him, it was like Satan had just entered the room. And Roger started pestering me about the Exodus and wouldn't take later for an answer. Gary yelled out, "Keep it down, Falk, or we'll ask you to leave." So what I did was I left the room because Roger was not going to let this go. This year, Gary said to me, "I want to apologize because I didn't realize it was Roger who was talking. Will you forgive me?" And I forgave him and shook his hand. I'll say this, Gary knows how to do an apology right. And I was more than eager to forgive. And then he asked me if I was a member of the NES. He said, "You attend all the sessions, why aren't you a member?" And I told him that I attend the sessions because they're of interest to my viewers. But I don't exactly feel welcome here. Gary claimed that they needed dissenting voices and invited me to become a member of the NEAS. Okay, I said I would consider it. But I wonder if he would have said that with Stripling in the room. I noticed that things were very, very different after Stripling left. And I looked around and I noticed how small the numbers were at the NES sessions. So I'm wondering if they're having a membership decline that's causing them to start setting aside the purity tests. So it's striking me that the NES is having problems maintaining membership numbers. So they might need to diversify to people with dissenting views, as it were. But it was really, really nice to get that apology from Gary. And as I said, I'm so happy that I had the opportunity to shake his hand, forgive, and hopefully make a new friend as a result. Okay, now the last paper of ETS and the NES, which was by Jerry Boyce, and it was titled Shiloh's Jar, 3 Handles and 3 Hypotheses. This was the last paper that I heard at the NES /ETS here. The paper was over a medium-sized vessel that held some sort of liquid, perhaps a libation jar or an anointing vessel. These vessels are distinct in that they have 3 handles, one on each side of the body and one at the mouth of the spout. And they're commonly found near Shiloh. They're also decorated with a variety of marks. I recognize one mark that's called the dot ring pattern. And that mark is often found in Semitic assemblages in Egypt. Dot ring patterns are commonly found on Tel Yehudiah juglets of the Second Intermediate Period, on bronze clasps, and even on scarabs. So it was interesting to see these Semitic patterns that we find in Egypt also on this particular very strange kind of vessel. So it was an interesting paper. Now, that concluded the NES session and concluded the conference for both NES and ETS, but we still have ASOR to go through. At the end of the NES session, I was having a conversation with Clayton Van Huss, whom I'm very friendly with, even though he both is with ABR and with the NES. But as I was having my conversation with Van Huss, I was approached by Stephen Rudd. Now, for those of you who don't know Steve Rudd, he is a popularizer. He's done a lot of volunteer work with both ABR and the NES. He doesn't have any formal education, but he's done a lot of volunteer digging, and he does a lot of websites on behalf of the NES. So he's one of their more important volunteers. Now, Rudd tried to guess my denomination. Good luck with that. But the other thing was, he then asked me not to tell anyone on YouTube what happened at the NES meetings, which was, I thought, kind of a nervy thing to ask. I told him I couldn't do that. I have a lot of viewers that are very interested as to what happens at the NES. And I did tell him I will report it fairly. I'll report the good papers as good and the bad papers as bad. But I also told him, too, that the NES meeting is a public forum. It's not private. So it's like, no, I'm not going to do that. So, I mean, I don't know what he was afraid of, but no, I don't think he was worried that I would scoop him. I just think he was just going to think that I was just going to completely paint the NES in an unflattering light. Well, there is some unflattering light there. But that's not really my problem, is it? That's a him problem, not a me problem. Okay, so that ended the Thursday conference. Friday morning, November 21st. With ETS over, I spent the rest of my time at the conference of the American Society of Overseas Research, ASOR. And the first paper that I went to in the morning was by Michael Hassel, An Egyptian Scarab in Sennacherib's Destruction at Tel Lachish, Chronological Considerations. Now, in Hassel's dig, a Tutmosis III, who died circa 1425 BC, his scarab was found in the destruction layer at the Assyrian conquest of Lachish. What's interesting about this is the latest Tutmosis III scarab that is securely datable. Now, commemorative scarabs of Tutmosis III are found across the Levant. But what's so interesting about this finding is it shows that commemorative scarabs of Tutmosis III were still in circulation 800 years after the reign of Tutmosis III. Very interesting finding. Long after people had forgotten who Tutmosis III was, his commemorative scarabs are still in circulation. Shows you the impact of this king. Very, very interesting finding. The next paper I attended was Emily K. Smith, who did a paper called Gift of Osiris, a preliminary analysis of Egypto-Nubian drinking practices on the ancient colonial frontier. Now, this study depended upon the fact that alcohol causes pitting and scalding, which is kind of a rough surfacing, inside of ceramic vessels. This new method can only determine the presence of alcohol, but only in the absence of tamarind and rice that can create false positives. Now, tamarind and rice are absent from the diets of Egyptians and Nubians, so this method can actually show the distribution of alcohol in ceramic vessels. Now, we have to point out that this method is still in its infancy and can't be used for dating. Moreover, it is highly subjective. You have to basically give it a low, middle, high amount of pitting and scalding. So it can be very subjective. Now, Smith concludes that this paper by claiming that alcohol consumption appears to have increased during the hard times that coincided with the lessening of Egyptian control. That is, during the Third Intermediate Period. So, drinking associated with hard times? Okay. That's kind of understandable. Not an earth-shattering result, but a result nonetheless. The next paper is by Emily Smith Sangster, which is a different Emily Smith. So we have two Emily Smiths here back to back. This is the Emily Smith Sangster. And she did a paper called The Akhmosis Cemetery, Insight into the Funerary Practices of the Early New Kingdom up in Upper Egypt. Now, I found this paper very interesting. It was a preliminary report of an excavation at a cemetery that was just north of the pyramid of Akhmos I at Abydos. And the cemetery dates the late 17th, early 18th dynasty. But it's also very idiosyncratic compared to other known burials of the time frame. Well, the first thing of note here was that most of the coffins in the cemetery were box coffins, and this is normally associated with Middle Kingdom burials, not Second Intermediate Period or New Kingdom burials. So that's the first interesting result. There were also no rishi coffins. Now, rishi coffins are anthropoid coffins that seem to have an extra wide head. Okay? They stand out from other coffins and are characteristic of 17th dynasty burials. But at this cemetery, there were discovered 4 anthropoid coffins, but not a single one of them was a rishi coffin. So it's very interesting that while these Rishi coffins are sort of kind of thumbprints of the 17th dynasty, and they're found at sites like in Thebes, none of them are found right next to, say, the most important king of the 17th dynasty. They also found at the site the earliest known corn mummy. Also, they've also found the earliest securely dated walnut. Now, this is also really interesting because walnuts are not native to Egypt. They're imported goods into Egypt. So they actually found a whole walnut, which is super cool. It's actually super cool because it showed that in that late 17th dynasty, early 18th dynasty, there's still some trade relations going on here at the time. Very interesting. Something about these burials that was also very peculiar. They seem to have lacked Theban influences, and their assemblages seem to be more influenced by local culture. The tombs lacked New Kingdom and Second Intermediate magical items. No Shabti figures. There were no Shabti figures found in the burials. No amulets. These are local burials that seem to have had no influence of the burial customs that were normal at Thebes. So they seem to have been, at least their burial culture around Abydos here, seems to have been isolated from, say, the more normative burial practices that come out of Thebes. So very interesting. This is a very interesting excavation, very interesting set of burials, and in some ways it repaints how we're to figure these out. Now, these would have been important people because they're being buried right beside the king. So these are like very important figures that are being buried there. So interesting results from a very interesting excavation. And the next paper I listened to was Jessica Nitsky and Jason Silvestri, entitled Life and Death at El Hibna, Preliminary Results of the 2024 Field Season of the UC Berkeley El Hibna Project, Beni Suef, Egypt. Okay, now this site, El Hibna, dates from between 1000 BC to Dynasty 25, Dynasty 26. And this digging season focused on a granary, which was part of a fortress near the Shishonk, the First Temple, and Temenos. The dig started as a kind of rescue archaeology. They were afraid that rising water table caused by local agriculture was going to destroy the site. But as they were digging, looters started to pillage the site. So their efforts quickly changed from rescue archaeology to recovery archaeology, basically going in where the looters were starting to dig. Now, what they found there was a bit peculiar. They found several mud bricks that had been stamped with blank cartouches. Okay, the cartouches weren't drawn in; they were stamped in. So it looks like that the makers of these blood bricks had stamps with blank cartouches that were basically ready to be filled in, but they hadn't filled them in. So very interesting that mud brick makers would have this sort of accessory, the stamp for empty cartouches. Really interesting. The site also seems to have had a local industry of textile productions. Particularly, there's evidence that they did flax spinning using their teeth. The back molars of some of the skeletons recovered had this groove that showed that they were using their back molars to spin flax. So what they would do is take flax, put it on one side of the mouth, and then just spin it out as a single thread through the other side. Very interesting practice, and it does have there is a modern analog to this as well. But it forms a groove in their teeth to do this. Plus, there's a lot of fabric samples at the site. So it's clear that they were producing a lot of textiles there. Now, another thing that's very peculiar of the site was where the burials were found. They didn't seem to dig a hole in the ground and put the burials in there. Now, most of the burials show evidence of mummification. So that leads us to believe that these are at least middle-class workers. These are craftsman class, at least. But where they find these burials isn't dug into the tell. It's basically on the top of the walls. Now, this raises all sorts of interesting questions. Were these mummies essentially, did they dig out a section of the top of the wall and then place the mummy in that? Or did the tell fill up so that you had sand coming in and filling into between the walls, and then they just dug down into the sand where they found the wall and buried them there? Okay? We're not sure. But it's really interesting because you do not find mummies normally buried on the tops of walls. Very unusual. So, to be honest, that's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy to find mummies buried in walls. You don't normally see this. You'll see sometimes mummies buried underneath the floors. You'll sometimes find them in rock-cut tombs and all that. I've never seen them on a wall. It's very strange. Okay, the next paper I attended was by James Hoffmeyer, Pierce Paul Kreisman, and Thomas W. Davies, entitled The Search for Pharaoh Taharka's Funerary Temple, Reisner's Temple 400 at Nuri, Sudan. Okay, now this paper was presented by James Hoffmeyer. At the beginning of the paper, he gave a tribute to Thomas Davies, Donald Redford, and Kenneth Kitchen, who all passed away this year. The paper was about the attempt to find Reisner's Temple 400 to discover if this was Taharka's funerary temple. Because Taharka built a big pyramid, but nobody was really sure where the funerary temple was. It would be very unusual to have a big temple, a big pyramid built without a funerary temple. They almost all pyramids of any substantial size also come with a funerary temple attached. Now, while they did find the site of Temple 400, they were unable to completely clear out the area because of the overwhelming amount of sand. They did clear away some of the reliefs and did an analysis, and what they found was promising but inconclusive. So they're still not sure if it's Taharka's funerary temple. They think it is a Taharka temple. They're just not sure if it is his funerary temple. And inconclusive results just happen. This is just pretty normal. But again, it's trying to push that needle forward to get more results to then be able to draw the proper conclusions.